off with some worship. So wherever you are, just join us.
These words from Psalms 22 were the last words of Jesus before his death on the cross. He was well acquainted with feeling overlooked by God. But it is precisely in times like these that we must remember the words of Jesus given in his most famous sermon. A sermon given on top of a mountain. A sermon which begins like this. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
Alrighty. What is up, everybody? Welcome to Wayfarers Christian Church. I'm very excited, very happy to see all of y'all who have tuned into this Sunday evening live stream with us. I'm always super thankful for everybody that has been tuning in to the services and just interacting with the different things that we have been doing. Like I said, my name is Nick Griffin. I'm the lead pastor here at Wayfarers Christian Church. And if you have been tuning in with us over this last few weeks, you know that we've been in a series looking at the Sermon on the Mount. This is one of the most famous passages of Jesus. This is the verses that you hear people quote all the time, the verses of Jesus that even people who aren't Christians, the verses that those people know. More than likely, most of those verses come from this Sermon on the Mount. And we just felt like this is a really awesome way to start the new year by looking at this, one of the most famous passages, one of the most famous sermons, the most famous sermon that Jesus gave, where we can just really look at a lot of his teachings. It's a great way to start the new year. And over the last couple of weeks, our teaching pastor, Noah Randolph, has been doing a little bit of an intro. He's taken us through the Beatitudes, that section that you saw Jacob, one of the other members here at the church, go through in that video before the scripture. And then last week, Noah took us through a little bit of some of the introductory verses that kind of lay the groundwork for what it means to be light, what it means to be salt of the earth, the sort of intro and groundwork of the Sermon on the Mount. But Noah kind of hinted at it last week, and it's kind of funny. This is one of the most difficult passages to explain of the whole Sermon on the Mount, and Noah was like, all right, Nick, here you go. I'm giving you the hardest one. Just jump right in. It was really funny. Last Sunday after the service ended, Noah came up to me and he said, man, I'm really glad you're the one that's doing next Sunday's passage, because I am not that super interested in doing that myself. I'm going to give you the hard one. Here is the hard passage that a lot of people have had difficulties interpreting. Have fun. So that's what we're going to do today. We are going to go through this difficult passage, one of the most difficult teachings of Jesus to understand, especially as it relates to a lot of these ideas of the law. But before I get into it, I wanted to I was trying to think through examples of my life that could kind of help to illustrate a little bit about what I think the point Jesus is making in this passage is. And it's really funny, the first example that came to mind was something that is a recent discovery of mine, which is that I actually have recently decided that I really like cherries. I used to hate cherries, or so I thought. But the reality was the reason I thought that was because I didn't realize that cherries were like a real fruit. This is kind of a weird thing to admit, but I always had only ever had like those jars of maraschino cherries. That was my experience. Those like really fake super red cherries that they put on top of like sundaes. That was all I had ever had when it comes to cherries, and that was my experience with cherries. And I had just never had like a real cherry, the fruit that those maraschino cherries come from. And my wife Adrienne, she was doing some grocery shopping, and we had just been married for about a year at this point. I remember she came home with a bag of real cherries, and I just let them sit on the countertop because I was like, oh no, I hate cherries. I hate maraschino cherries. I never had any cherries. These cherries looked a little weird because they looked different than what I remembered, but I was just like, no, I hate cherries. And I don't even remember how the conversation came up, but we were sitting at dinner. Adrienne mentioned that she had got some cherries at the grocery store, and I mentioned how much I hated cherries, and I hated cherry-flavored things, and she was just really adamant. She's like, no, you gotta try like a real cherry though. Don't try like this is different. It's a very different thing. It's not the same thing to what you're used to. And she forced me to try it, and it was incredible. It feels like my life changed after that moment. It was a BC AD moment. This is this moment before cherries versus after cherries. I don't know. Like, it was just like this moment where I realized, wow, this is incredible. And it's really funny. We have them at our house all the time now. It's like one of my go-to snacks. I love snacking on cherries. But what had to change is I had to have the real thing, the complete thing, the real version that those maraschino cherries were kind of slowly based on. And you'll kind of see how that connects here in a second, but there was a second example that was kind of popped into my head after that as I was trying to really understand how to explain what I think Jesus is saying in this passage. And it was an experience that I've had a lot recently. You see, I've had the real privilege, honestly, of getting to travel to all different kinds of countries all over the world. I've been able to travel a lot to other countries. And if you've ever had a friend maybe that went to study abroad somewhere, maybe they went to Germany or to France to study abroad for college, maybe they went to Japan, maybe they went on a mission trip where they got to go to Haiti or got to go to somewhere in South America, and they just got to experience a whole nother country, a whole different culture to their own. This thing that I've noticed always with people that get to travel overseas is that when they come back to the States, they are just different. They are different. Their whole perspective, their whole worldview, things are different once they have experienced a different country. And it's really funny. People who have gone overseas will often kind of annoy the people who haven't by just always referencing this trip that they went to overseas. I've been doing this recently, I know, because my wife and I, a couple years ago, got to do this trip to Israel, and it completely changed everything. I'm reading about all these Bible stories, but once I got to see them with my eyes, it was a whole different experience completely. And I had a similar experience whenever I was a kid and I got to travel to Costa Rica. I got to go to the country of Costa Rica with my parents, and we got to travel deep into the Costa Rican rainforest to visit a remote tribe, and we were there to preach and share the gospel with them and just to help them out a little bit with what they needed. And one of the coolest experiences I had while we were on that trip is I got to try like fresh mangoes that were off the tree itself, you know, that had ripened on the tree. Some of them had ripened to the point to where they had just fallen onto the ground, and they were that ripe. And I'm telling you, once you take a taste of the real deal, the real mango ripened on the tree, you just can't go back to what you buy at the grocery store. And I know that I'm just that annoying person who always is talking about all of these kinds of things. And you probably noticed it with whatever your friends might have experienced when they've gone overseas. There are just certain experiences that I feel like you only get a taste of here in the States, but in other contexts, in other cultures, in other places, you get the full experience, the real experience in a lot of ways. And I thought of one more example. I don't just have food examples, but that is something that I think about a lot. Obviously, I love food. I have a lot of food examples, but I had one more thought that really kind of brought a lot of these concepts together for me. And that was recently I had this experience of being able to take over a job that my brother, Jeremy, used to do. You see, my brother, Jeremy, he was a youth minister at our home church, the church we grew up at. It's called East Wind Christian Church. And on top of the youth ministry duties, he also got to do a lot of their tech duties. He got to help them with the cameras, with the audio and lighting, and a lot of the equipment. And it's really cool. Jeremy really felt like he wanted to kind of move on from that church ministry world and move into the world of education. And so he started working with Memphis Teacher Residency here in town and has moved on to be a school teacher in the public schools in Shelby County. He's doing really, really awesome stuff there. What was really funny is that whenever he left that job at the church, they needed somebody to do the youth ministry stuff. I have no interest in doing that. I told them pretty early on, I am like a 45-year-old man stuck in a 28-year-old man's body. Everybody who knows me knows that is 100% true. I have just always been an old man from the beginning. You don't want me to do youth ministry. But the tech side, the tech stuff that he was doing, I love that kind of stuff. I'm definitely a tech nerd. A lot of the cameras and all the different things that we do for our services here, that is stuff that I do. And what the church didn't realize was that even the tech stuff Jeremy was doing, that was still kind of me too. Basically, anytime they asked Jeremy for some sort of tech thing he needed done, he would just text me and be like, "Hey, Nick, the church needs some new projectors or a new light or a new camera. What should I get? What should I get?" And I would just, I would give him my suggestions. He would pass those suggestions on to the church, and then he would they would buy whatever the suggestions were. And so whenever the opportunity came up for somebody else to take that tech job, Jeremy, he went and he talked to the staff at the church, and he said, "I think Nick should do it." And he kind of had to confess. He said, "Really, honestly, Nick's been doing it the whole time. Nick's the one who has been the person that I have been consulting with. So honestly, right now, you're just cutting out the middleman. You can just go straight to Nick." And so that's what they did, and I've been helping them out with a lot of their live streams, a lot of their tech equipment, and a lot of those things. And that's a lot of what I do on Sunday mornings, is I've been helping my home church, Eastwind, with a lot of their tech equipment. And what was cool about that experience, and it was funny, I talked to Jeff, the lead pastor at Eastwind, about this conversation he had with Jeremy, and he was just talking about how much easier and simpler it was to cut out the middleman, go straight to the real thing, go straight to the person who was originally doing all of the consulting to begin with. So what does all of this have to do with the words of Jesus? Maybe if you're putting the pieces together a little bit of what I am trying to explain, I think you can kind of see maybe a little bit of the general idea of what it is that Jesus is trying to explain as it relates to the law specifically. But to really understand what Jesus says, I think we need to understand one particular word. There's one word that is super important to understand what Jesus says and to understand what he means in this passage. And it's a word that comes up over and over and over again in the book of Matthew, the book that we're reading from in this passage. And that is the word, in English, fulfilled. The word fulfilled. If you ever read the first 2 chapters of Matthew, there are chapters that get read a lot around Christmas time. I encourage you. I'm giving you homework this week. Go home this week. Go read the first 2 chapters of Matthew and try to notice how many times Matthew uses that word fulfilled. It comes up over and over and over and over again. And if you read the entire book of Matthew, you see it is this theme that just keeps coming around and around and around. It is this one word. It is the theme of Matthew. If I had to pick one word that I would say is the theme of the entire book, it is the word fulfilled. And it's a particular Greek word, that word fulfilled, the word that we translate in English fulfilled. In the original Greek, the language it was originally written in, it's a really fun word. It's the word plerou. Plerou is the Greek word. And plerou is the word that gets translated fulfilled. But most literally, it has this connotation of being filled to the brim, all the way to the brim. So I never do visual examples, but we're going to try one today because I think it'll help get our minds around exactly what this word pleroo means. So I talked about cherries earlier. I've got some off-brand cherry cola. We're going to try to give you the visual explanation here of exactly what is meant by that word pleroo. You see, Jesus is describing what the law was originally, what the Old Testament law was specifically. You see, Noah and I, lots of times when we like to talk about the Old Testament law, we like to use the word Torah specifically. It's the Hebrew word Torah more often to describe that, just because we think sometimes that the English word law just does not really fully explain exactly what was meant for the early Hebrews, especially the early Jews. You see, Torah is this Hebrew word that can mean a whole bunch of different things. It can mean law. Law is a good way to describe it. It's one of the ways that you can describe what Torah means. But it also can mean instruction. It can also mean sort of guidance. It can also mean ideas of wisdom specifically can be brought up in there. You see, when we think of law, we think of like government laws. We think of things that are crimes, things that you're going to be punished for specifically, and those are included in Torah. But it's not just that, and that's why I don't like to use the word law specifically always, because it has very specific connotations for us that I don't think really just fully get the entire experience of what is meant by that word Torah. So I want to reread this passage for us. Reread this passage from Matthew 5, and we'll pull it up here quickly. And I'm going to replace the words there with Jesus. And I want you to keep that idea in mind, that idea of instruction, of Torah. And this is Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And notice that word, fulfill. Pleroo, fulfill them. "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the Torah, until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the Torah, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." That word pleroo that Jesus uses, that word fulfill in that passage. Like I said, in common everyday language, what it means is filled to the brim. So this container of cherry Coke over here, generic cherry Coke, this one would be described as fulfilled, as pleroo, as filled to the brim. You see, I could go a little bit higher here, but then we would start spilling out of this spout at the top. This is as full as you can possibly get this one. This one over here is only partly filled. It's still got cherry Coke in it. It's still got this generic cherry Coke in it, but it is not filled to the brim. It is only partially filled. And this is the example that you see over and over and over again. This is the contrast that you see over and over again in Matthew specifically. Matthew is contrasting versions of things that are half filled versus things that are filled to the brim versus things that are full filled, things that are pleroo. And he does this in all kinds of different ways. One of the specific ways, one of the most interesting things he does, is that he goes and shows a lot about how Jesus is the fulfillment of a lot of these sort of half versions of characters that you get in the Old Testament. You see in the Old Testament, there's a lot of famous characters. You've got King David. You've got the Moses, who functions as a prophet and as a mediator. You've got Solomon, the king, who is this wise king. And you have Abraham, the sort of father of the nations, the father of faith. All of these different characters. You've got Noah, who listens to God and does what God wants him to do in the face of this great global flood. And each of these characters are really amazing characters that give us a really good examples of what we should be doing and how we should be following, how we should be living our lives in ways that we can please God specifically. But there's a common thread as you read the stories of every single one of these characters, which is that they all eventually fail. They all mess up in some form or another. Abraham rapes his maidservant instead of trusting the promise of Isaac that was coming to him. You see Noah, he gets drunk and just kind of exposes himself in front of his children. You see the King David, famously, he falls down on his face and he has to admit before God that he has been unfaithful, that he has committed adultery with Bathsheba. And it is interesting. It's out of a relationship with Bathsheba, that woman that he commits adultery with. It is out of a relationship with her that King Solomon comes. And we see King Solomon, this king who is wise, and that's the whole thing about King Solomon. He's super wise, but even Solomon gets to a point to where he is marrying women who are serving other gods, serving idols, and you see Solomon go astray. And there's one particular character, Moses. Moses was like the most important for the early Jews. And Moses was the one that they really viewed as like, yeah, Moses has got it figured out. If there's anybody who's filled to the brim with everything that needs to be done, everybody who is the most pleru of all of them, it's got to be Moses. But if you read the story and you see specifically the story of Moses, you see that even Moses fails. He actually fails so drastically that he isn't even allowed to enter the promised land, the land that he is leading the people of Israel to. What you find over and over and over again, if you read the Old Testament, is you see that these characters, they were filled with good things. They had good things in them, but they were not filled to the brim. They were not the complete and final versions. And what we see Matthew doing is we see Matthew setting Jesus up as the fulfilled version of every single one of those characters. It's really cool. We don't have time to go into all of it today, but there is just some amazing, awesome ways in which Matthew shows us that Jesus is the true King David, the one that fully completes everything that David's supposed to do. We see ways that Jesus is King Solomon, the wise king who truly explains the law. Matthew sets up ways to show us how Jesus is the true Abraham, the one who is going to fully accomplish the promise that was given to Abraham specifically. And there's this really key, awesome moment where Matthew shows us that Jesus is even the fulfilled, full version of Moses himself. And there's lots of ways he does that. I'm just going to quickly highlight a few of them that's just really interesting to me. One of the first ways he does it is that in that early Christmas story, in the beginnings of Matthew, he shows this gruesome scene where King Herod at that time is afraid of the baby Jesus, and he goes and he kills all of the firstborn children in this town of Bethlehem. And Jews who would have been reading their Bibles, they would have immediately known that this was a callback to Moses, because that is the way that the story of Moses begins. You see in the story of Moses that Pharaoh is scared of the growing Israelite slaves, and so he goes and he kills all of the children. And you get this connection there, even from the beginning of Jesus' life, between Moses and Jesus himself. And Jesus has to flee to Egypt. And there's this amazing connection where you see that eventually Jesus has to flee, find refuge in Egypt, and then he comes out of Egypt back into Israel, back into the promised land. And the language even that's used there of coming out of Egypt, coming out of Egypt, out of that land that represents this slavery, and coming to the true land of Israel. The Jews who would have been reading the book of Matthew, they would have immediately seen all those connections, and they would have seen like, oh wow, this is exactly like Moses coming out of Egypt into the promised land. You see that specifically with Jesus. There's this really incredible story later on where Jesus' face is sort of transfigured, and his disciples see this kind of amazing vision with Jesus. And one of the details that really sticks out in that vision that they see is that they see Jesus' face shining. It's like there's light shining from his face. And if you're somebody who has studied the Bible, you know that description is also a connection that immediately draws you into Moses. Moses has this famous story where he goes into the presence of God, and when he comes down, his face is shining so bright that they have to put a veil over it because they just can't handle how bright his face is shining. And all of those connections would have been immediately clear to all of these Jews, all of the Jews that were making the connections between Moses. They would have immediately seen all these connections with Jesus. But the thing Matthew is showing us is that Moses was just the half version, the half full version of what was to come. What you get in Jesus is you get the fulfilled version of Moses. And this whole Sermon on the Mount is kind of a culmination, really, of that Mosaic moment a lot. If you remember, what Moses does is he goes up onto a mountain, and on top of that mountain is where he receives the 10 Commandments, where he receives the law, where he receives the Torah specifically. It is up on top of that mountain where he receives the law. And there's a detail at the very beginning of this passage, the Sermon on the Mount, that we sometimes miss, where Matthew makes a key point to emphasize that Jesus sees the crowds of people, and he also goes up onto a mountain to deliver this sermon. What you see is Jesus as the fulfilled Moses, the full version of what Moses was only hinting at. We see that Moses gets the law, he gets the Torah, whereas Jesus goes specifically onto the top of a mountain, just like Moses, but to give us specifically the law of Christ. And you see the Apostle Paul pick up on this later on. He mentions it specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. You see the Apostle Paul, he's talking about how he will kind of change what he does based on who he's reaching out to. So if he's reaching out to Jews, he will follow Torah specifically. But if he is reaching out to Gentiles, to people who don't know any of those 10 Commandments, any of those Old Testament laws, he kind of changes his strategy. And I want you to notice one specific phrase that he mentions. And so he says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, under Torah, I become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under that law. To those not having the law, the Gentiles, I became like one not having the law." And then notice this, "Though I myself am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having under the law." So when he goes to the Gentiles, he's making this point that he, will just kind of change his tactics based on who he's trying to go to. If he's trying to go to the Jews, he's going to be like one under Torah. If he's trying to go to the Gentiles, they don't know about it. He's not going to do that. But he has this kind of those words in parentheses there where he's just trying to make a point extra clear to us, which is just that even when he goes to the Gentiles, he wants us to be extra clear that it's not like he's just free to do whatever he wants. It's not like he just gets to just roam free and do whatever it could be that he possibly wants. No, even when he is going to the Gentiles, even when he's going to these people that don't have Torah, he himself is still under Christ's law. And I remember when I first read that passage, I was like, well, what does that mean? What is Christ's law? What is the law of Christ? Sometimes, based on your theology, that may kind of sound like a contradiction in terms. But the more and more that I have studied the scriptures, and the more and more that I've started to study this particular passage, I have just come to a conclusion that I think this Sermon on the Mount is what Paul is referring to. If you want to figure out where in the Bible do you get Christ's law, you get it here, on the top of the mountaintop, where the true and fulfilled Moses is finally giving us the final and full version of the law. And this would have been very, very clear to the Jews. I don't think they would have missed the symbolism of this moment of exactly what was happening by Jesus going on top of this mountaintop to deliver Christ's law. And whenever they saw him doing that, you kind of see this tension that is always kind of there between the Jews and between Jesus, where they're worried that he's just throwing away all of that had happened before. And when they see him go up onto this mountain to deliver Christ's law, you can see some of them are questioning, well, what does this mean about Torah? What does this mean about the previous law? And Jesus, knowing what they are thinking, knowing what questions they may have, he kind of preemptively answers them. And he says specifically, I don't want you to think that I've come to abolish the law, the Torah. In fact, even the smallest, most tiniest details of what was in Torah, I'm not here to throw all of that away. No, I am here to fulfill it, to bring it to its brim, to bring it to its completion, to bring it to the final form, the full version of exactly what it would be. I think in some ways he's saying that the Torah, the Old Testament law, the bits and pieces that they had in those those first 5 books of the Bible, especially, are more like this. They're still good. It's still filled with really good tasting cherry Coke, but it's not as good as the final and full version, the version that is filled all the way to the brim. So what he's doing is he's not coming to just throw this away and get rid of it completely. That's not what he's doing. What he is doing, what he is trying to do, what he has come to do specifically, is he has come to take this halfway filled version of it, and he's come to fill it all the way to the brim. He has come to fulfill the purposes of that law. You see, lots of times, like I said, we think of the law as just these set of rules that were given, and maybe some people might think of the law specifically as like sins, as things that everything that's in the law is a sin, and so it helps us figure out what are sins and what are not sins. But I think what we miss a little bit in that is that the law of the Torah, it had a specific purpose. It had this purpose of being a tutor, of teaching the people of Israel about God specifically. In fact, in Galatians chapter 3, it's just, again, some homework for you this week. I would encourage you to go read Galatians chapter 3. I don't want to get into it today just for the sake of time. But you can see the Apostle Paul explain it specifically. He explains the way that Torah, the law, specifically was a tutor. It's like a guardian. It's a simple early version to kind of help explain certain things to the Jews. It was supposed to explain things like the holiness of God. I think that was a big purpose of the law. It was supposed to explain things like what kinds of behaviors are the kinds that are harmful to human beings specifically. But I also think that ultimately one of the most incredible, awesome things about the law is that it was pointing to Jesus Christ himself. And you see this all over and over and over again. There's so many amazing examples of this. If you start reading through the law, you start seeing that it has this very specific purpose of pointing people to Jesus. It's really interesting. After Jesus' resurrection, there's this interesting story where Jesus meets these 2 disciples. A lot of people think they're probably a husband and a wife, but the Bible just calls them 2 disciples. But this husband and wife that are walking on a road to this town called Emmaus. And this is the last homework assignment, I promise, but I would encourage you, go read this story as well. The disciples on the road to Emmaus. And what you can see, what's so interesting in this, is that the disciples, they are so distraught. They've just seen Jesus crucified. They think that they've lost everything. They think that this whole movement is just gone. Everything they thought about Jesus, maybe they were wrong about it, and they're just not sure what to think. And so they meet the resurrected Jesus on this road to Emmaus, and they don't even recognize him. They don't recognize that is who Jesus is. And Jesus does this really incredible thing because they have a long journey. They're walking on foot for miles, and on this long journey, Jesus does this incredible thing where it says he opens the scriptures, he opens that Torah, that law, and he shows them from that law everything that it was pointing to about him specifically. You see, there are all kinds of purposes to Torah, and as we continue in this series on the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to see this a little bit. You're going to see that Jesus is not throwing away that law. He's not getting rid of it. He's not throwing it off to the side. He's not saying, no, none of that matters anymore. What he is doing is he is taking that law and he is showing you what it is meant to point to, which is him specifically and the work that he is doing. There's all kinds of different ways it does that. And there's even some kind of complicated explanations that we may have a little bit of trouble understanding sometimes when we start to read the Old Testament law. There's some weird Old Testament laws if you've ever read through it. You know, things like you can't wear clothing that has multiple threads together. You can't multiple types of threads. You can't plant two types of plants in your field. You can't eat pigs, you can't eat bacon, you can't eat pork specifically. That's an aspect of the Old Testament law that a lot of people are familiar with. And then there's all kinds of rules and regulations in there that are confusing for us. And I know that this is something that comes up a lot, and I always like to just kind of tease a little bit what we're going to talk about in our weekly deep dives in these podcasts we do in the middle of the week on Wednesdays. And I would encourage you, if you're confused about some of those laws, like the ones that it might seem like we have just done away with, the ones that it might seem like we just don't follow, those things like, pork, we definitely still eat bacon. A lot of us are very into pork, especially here in Memphis, this barbecue town. We never really worry about whether our clothing is made of multiple threads. There's all kinds of all of these laws that it might seem like we are not following, but I think what is kind of incredible, if we really understand this context of what Jesus is doing, of the kind of fulfilled final versions of it, is you find over and over and over again in the New Testament that what Jesus is doing is he is showing us that those things were pointing to him, we're pointing to the Messianic age, we're pointing to very specific things that, for one reason or another, are not necessarily needed anymore because of the work that Jesus has done. And the thing I want to end with is just this very simple point, which is that Jesus says that none of this will pass away until everything is accomplished, until everything that needs to be done is fulfilled. And it's really interesting to me. I have always really resonated with a lot of the different words of Jesus when he is on the cross. But one of the words that just really always just impacts me when you look at the different things that Jesus said while he was being crucified is that he has this very famous phrase. It's the very last thing he says, where he just says, "It's finished." He says, "It is finished," and he gives up his spirit at that point, is what the scriptures say. And what we see is that a lot of this instruction, these moral teachings that you get kind of in the Torah, they're pointing us in very specific directions, but the point I really want you to get is that ultimately what they are doing is they are pointing to Jesus Christ himself. Jesus is the fulfillment of all of those Old Testament characters. He is the final full version of Moses, of David, of Solomon, of Abraham. He is the complete and final version of all of those. And what we find is that Jesus really is the sort of complete fullness of everything that we could ever possibly need. You might have heard Christians sometimes say this kind of weird phrase where they say Jesus is the answer. Whatever the question is, Jesus is the answer. But the more that I read in the scriptures, the more and more that I am just overwhelmingly over and over and over again finding that if you are feeling empty yourself, if you're feeling like you're half full in some form, if you're feeling like there is an emptiness in you, if you're feeling like the things that you are going after in life just are not satisfying like you thought they would, maybe you are pursuing after your career, maybe you are pursuing after your education, maybe you are pursuing after wealth. I don't know what it is, the things that you are pursuing after. What humans find over and over again is that all of those things that we are pursuing, they just leave us empty. They don't really fully, completely satisfy. They're like fake versions of it. They're like the maraschino cherries that I had at the beginning. They are like the sort of GMO grown mangoes that I can buy at Kroger compared to the ones on the tree. If you want the real thing, if you want the full experience of what it truly means to be human, the only way you're going to find that is by following Jesus Christ, by being united together with him, by being in relationship with him specifically. Jesus is ultimately the fulfillment of what all of these things point to. And the only way you're going to find that fullness and completion is in Jesus Christ himself. Now, over the next few weeks, I'm going to explain a little bit about how this law of Christ works. How does this Sermon on the Mount work? How is it a fulfillment of these Old Testament laws? How is it the full and final version of what these Old Testament laws were only maybe partly versions of? The Apostle Paul even kind of compares them as like shadows versus the real thing. He says these Old Testament Torah, it was like a shadow, but in Christ, you have the fullness and the real thing. So if you want to see how that works out and how Jesus actually explains that, I would encourage you just continue to tune in. And if you want to understand a little bit about some of those weird laws that confuse us and that it may feel like we as Christians are just picking and choosing what to follow, I'd also encourage you to tune in this Wednesday for the deep dive, and we're going to go specifically into that. You know, if you want to figure out, is it okay for you to continue to eat bacon or not, tune in this Wednesday. We'll explain it a little bit. I'll help to put the pieces together of this fulfillment in that Wednesday deep dive. But ultimately, I just want to leave you with that final point. Jesus is the only way that you are ever going to find full completion, filled to the brim with everything that you need. If you feel empty, if you feel lost in any way whatsoever, I promise you, Jesus is the complete fulfillment that you are seeking. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for today. Thank you for all of the amazing things that you do for us. Thank you for the work that you did in your life and on the cross. Thank you for the completed work that you have done on the cross. The fact that we can really say that it is finished. There is an accomplishment that really happened there in the cross. And I am just overwhelmingly more and more every day just so excited to continue to get a better idea of what it means that I am now living on the other side of that incredible moment. I am living in the fulfilled age. I'm not living in the part-way imitation version of it that some people have had experiences of in the past. But no, I get the privilege of being able to just participate in the work that you have done, the completed work that you have done, the fulfillment that you brought. Thank you so much, Jesus, for that fulfillment, for all the things that you have done for us. Help us to learn what that means more and more every day. Help us to really grow to worship you more and to just see it practically in our everyday lives. What does that fulfillment of all these things mean ultimately? And we ask, Lord, that you would just ultimately help us to learn how to live the law of Christ, the life that you have called us to. Help us in these next few weeks to learn exactly what that law looks like, and help us through the power that only you can give to accomplish those things and to live out that life that you have prepared in advance for us. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see y'all next week.